Winter. Chicago. It came slowly at first, like breath turning to mist. Then, in a single week of January, the cold settled into the ground so deeply that even the horses seemed to step quieter. Snow fell not in flakes, but in packs, heavy and silent, and the roads looked less like streets and more like corridors carved through milk-white stone. This was the kind of winter that didn't simply visit a town, it took hold of it. Out near the edge of the city stood a small hospital. It wasn't proudly built, like the new clinics in central Chicago. Its bricks were older, rougher, as if the building itself had been stitched together with whatever materials were left at the end of summer. There were only 3 doctor rooms, 1 modest surgical space, and beds arranged closer than they should have been. But sick people do not always choose where to fall ill. They come where help is closest. Working in that hospital was a surgeon named Dr. Elias Hartman. He was 37 that winter, but those who met him often guessed an older age. Not because his face was lined, though it was in a dried, restrained manner, but because his eyes looked as though they had already seen too much and decided to stay silent about it. People didn't say he was friendly. They didn't say he was cold either. They said only, he cuts without fear. Most doctors, when pain enters a room, react first with words, comfort, reassurance, distraction. Hartman did not. He would first listen to the breathing. Then he would examine skin, pulse, color. And only after that, sometimes long after, he might speak. His voice was always controlled, never hurried. Even when a worker arrived screaming with a shattered hand from a machine accident, Hartman spoke as if breaking a quiet morning. Breathe slower. We begin now. Some thought this calmness was kindness. Others said it was indifference. What no one felt was neutrality. That winter, the hospital's heating system faltered more often than it worked. At dawn, sheets were stiff like thin glass. Nurses warmed cloth by pressing them against the back of coal ovens before wrapping them around patients' limbs. Frost crept over window frames, and every so often, when wind pressed too hard against the building, things rattled: glass bottles, metal tray edges, even bones in bodies. No one thought to complain. Everyone knew Chicago winters could be merciless. They accepted suffering as if it were part of the treatment. On the 14th of January, near 1 a.m, a horse-drawn wagon arrived. 2 men entered, carrying a third his leg, wrapped in a wool coat stiff with blood and ice. The patient breathed shallowly, his lips blue. His name was Samuel Cotter, 28, a stockyard worker. A crate had fallen on his leg at the slaughterhouse. The limb was crushed, and by the time he was brought into the hospital, it had turned nearly black. Cotter did not cry. It seemed he had already passed the stage of fear. When Hartman approached him, the man looked into the surgeon's eyes and spoke through chattering teeth. "If you cut, doctor, cut all the way." Hartman did not respond in words. He only nodded slowly. Once it was unusual to perform such. A major operation at night. Protocol would suggest stabilizing the patient until morning, waiting for another surgeon or at least a nurse anesthetist. But Hartman prepared the table himself. He checked the instruments without rushing, without hesitation. One of the nurses, Lottie Davies, entered the room briefly. She remembered that he stood over the leg for almost a full minute before the first incision, as if listening. Later, she would recall that he whispered something, though she did not. Hear what the surgical note he wrote in the log contained just 3 words: no hesitation required. What happened next was routine by technique, though far from routine by atmosphere. The leg, destroyed beyond saving, was removed. Davies held a lantern close to the table because the room lighting flickered intermittently. She later described seeing vapor rise from the severed tissue, not only from the cold air, but as if something deeper than breath was escaping. The procedure ended sometime near 3 in the morning. Hartman dressed the wound with unusual care. He washed his hands twice. Then he stood by the bed and waited until dawn, watching Cotter's breathing. The sky began to lighten, turning from black to the faintest gray. When the first nurse arrived for morning rounds, Cotter's bed was empty. Oddly, no one remembered seeing him leave, nor recalled preparing his body if he had died. There was no transfer note. His name was crossed off the registry in silent pencil. Nurse. Davies asked Hartman what happened. He answered simply. His condition changed. She waited for more, but nothing else came. Later that day, a hospital attendant, his name believed to be Walter Reeves, saw Hartman walking down the back corridor, carrying something wrapped in thick cloth. Blood had soaked through. Reeves did not stop him. 1 week later, that same attendant resigned without formal notice. The cold deepened. Patients began waking with frost at the edges of their mouths. Some claimed to feel colder inside than the room itself. It was around this time that Hartman started taking more cases often before dawn, sometimes without being called. At first, staff thought he was simply taking initiative due to the rising injuries for workers struggling in freezing conditions. Then other things began to slip from memory. Like the night, an elderly man with pneumonia was admitted and placed in Ward B. He was coughing blood. The nurse wrote in her shift log that Hartman saw to him personally. In the morning, the bed was empty. When asked, Hartman said he no longer required care. No death certificate. No transfer record. It was almost as if some patients, like the warmth in the building, simply drifted away without sound. The ice house stood behind the hospital. It was an old structure, built before the new refrigeration equipment had arrived years earlier. The door had been sealed, though nobody remembered exactly when. It was spoken of vaguely, as something that once mattered in a different era. Children were told not to play. Near it, nurses said you could still feel cold coming through the walls, even in summer. In late January, after finishing an operation on a man whose arm had frozen stiff while repairing a telegraph pole, Hartman went outside. A nurse saw him crossing the courtyard. He held a bundle under his arm. She was too far to see clearly. The snow muffled her steps when she tried to follow. She did not call out to him. The next morning, she asked if he had stored something in the supply cabinet, since inventory seemed unchanged. He replied, "I kept it where it cannot decay." She asked if that meant the morgue. He did not answer. Hartman's background was known to few. Born in Germany, trained in Budapest. He had spent time in field hospitals during industrial unrest. In Europe, treating men with injuries from machines, explosions, frostbite. Some said he had seen too much death at a young age. Others believed he had been sent to Chicago to start anew. No one knew what drew him to cold. But he often said something. Only once. Cold slows corruption. At first, people took that as medical reasoning. Later, they began to wonder if that was all he meant. One evening, in the middle of the fiercest blizzard of the season, Hartman was called to examine a farmer whose fingers had blackened from frostbite. The man was shaking violently, begging a surgeon not to cut. Hartman sat by his bed for nearly an hour, speaking quietly. Nobody heard the exact words, but the patient eventually calmed. That night, not all his fingers were removed, only 2. The farmer returned home 3 days later. He told his neighbors, "The doctor did what was necessary, but I think he saw something in me before he cut. I'm not sure what." Some nurses argued that Hartman saved more lives than he lost. They spoke of the man with the crushed hand, how he returned to work 2 weeks later, grateful. Others remembered his near-surgical stillness in moments of panic. But then someone asked how many of his patients couldn't be saved. No one could answer accurately. In February, The hospital superintendent, Thomas Brennan, met with Hartman. He requested a full report on the rising number of amputations. Hartman brought a single sheet of paper. Brennan expected figures, dates, causes. Instead, there was only one written line. To remove rot is to spare what remains. Brennan tried to discuss patient records, missing names, concerns among staff. Hartman listened, nodded, and replied only once. I perform the cuts that others hesitate to make. Without that, more would suffer. It was not exactly an argument, but Brennan did not know how to reply. That same night, another crate worker arrived with frostbitten legs. A ranger brought him in, saying the man had been found collapsed on the roadside. Hartman worked alone. When a nurse entered the operating room hours later, she found Hartman standing still, his hand on the man's chest. The patient was dead. There were no signs of an attempt at resuscitation. The nurse said Hartman whispered something before she backed away from the room. The words stayed with her. Too late for his limbs. Too late for his will. The following morning, the man was not in the morgue. His name was crossed off. No one spoke openly then. It was a different Erie. Hospitals were places where quiet often mattered more than answers. Nurses continued their rounds. Attendants kept cleaning instruments. Patients continued to arrive, and the cold continued to intensify, as if it were listening. Weeks later, long after Hartman's name had passed through the lips of too many uneasy staff members, the furnace failed entirely. That was the night when frost did not cover the bedsheets. It cracked them. February came like a closing door. Snow no longer danced down from the sky. It simply arrived, heavy and unannounced, as though it had grown tired of falling. The roads into Chicago narrowed to thin, silent passages between tall walls of ice. Mail was delayed. Wagons broke axles. And inside the hospital, something else began to break as well. Though no one could name it yet, Nurse Charlotte Lottie Davies had worked there for 3 winters. She believed she understood pain, the way some people understand music by listening to rhythm. But around the 15th of February, she noticed that screens changed pitch. The way patients cried out no longer sounded like fear. It sounded like surrender. She did not blame the cold. Cold only takes away life. Something else was taking away. Will? There were whispers among the staff that Dr. Hartman was working later and earlier by the day, until no one was quite sure if he ever left the hospital. Lights under the operating room door were seen before dawn, instruments already arranged. Once, a cleaner arrived at 5 in the morning to scrub floors and saw Hartman already gloved, standing before an empty table. The table, he said, was never truly empty. She did not ask what he meant. The first time someone openly questioned him was after the case of Martin R. Glover, a fisherman whose right foot had turned black during a delivery. He was brought in on February 3rd. Glover was conscious, frightened, and pleaded to keep his leg. Hartman examined it quietly and asked the nurse to dim the lamp. The man cried out that he could still walk with it, that he would recover. Hartman placed a hand on his shoulder. There are parts of us, he said softly, that Frost decides to keep. The amputation took place that evening. Glover survived the night. Staff saw him talking to another patient, speaking of his relief. By morning, the bed was vacant again. When questioned, Hartman wrote in the margin of the log, stability altered during night cycle. No certificate. No body. That was the 3rd. Disappearance. No one mentioned the first 2. Nurse. Davies began marking a small dot with pencil beside patient names she had physically seen alive after Hartman's surgery. She started noticing the dots did not always match the ones crossed. Off dots she never showed the chart to anyone. The temperature inside the building remained far below comfort. The radiators failed weekly, and repairs were slow. Coal was scarce. Blankets were spread double, then triple. In quieter moments, staff claimed they felt colder near the storage wing, especially beside the door that led outside, especially near the path to the old ice house. They didn't speak about it, but they walked that hallway faster. Some avoided it altogether. One night, a nursing assistant named Margaret Hale New to the hospital saw Hartman carrying a lantern toward the back entrance. She thought it strange because no patient transport was scheduled, and nobody used that exit in winter because ice built up in large ridges outside. She watched from the stairwell. He stood at the exit door for a long time, lantern lit. Then he opened the door. A thick draft pushed in, more like the inhale of something waiting. He stepped out without coat or hat. Margaret did not follow. He returned more than 20 minutes. Later, his hands were empty. The lantern had gone out. It was around this time that the nightmares began. Patients would scream in their sleep, not from pain, but from cold that crawled inside. Some said they heard footsteps that didn't belong to any of the staff, slow, dragging, as if someone walked with something heavy. One man woke shaking and said he saw a surgeon with no face standing at the end of his bed. The nurses dismissed it as fever dream. When asked which surgeon he saw, he simply replied, "The one who only looks at the bones." No further explanation, but from then on, the night staff always kept at least one lamp burning, not for patients, for themselves. Dr. Hartman's demeanor began to change. He never spoke much, but now his silences felt different, longer, as though he was listening not with his ears, but with something else. He began pausing during surgeries, not because of hesitation, but because he appeared to be waiting. Instruments in hand, eyes fixed on the wound, he would wait until a moment passed, then continue. Sometimes he whispered during operations. They could never make out the words, but one assistant described it as talking to the cold. She left 2 weeks later, married a farmer, never worked in medicine again. The fourth disappearance was impossible to ignore. A railway laborer named James O'Malley was admitted with severe frostbite in both legs. Hartman recommended immediate double amputation. O'Malley begged that both be removed at once so he would wake up finished. Hartman agreed. The surgery lasted almost 5 hours. The room temperature fell noticeably during the procedure. Lottie Davies swore she saw her breath hang before her face for several seconds. Afterward, Hartman remained beside the man all night. O'Malley survived until morning. He was alert enough to speak. He thanked the doctor with tears. At 6:32 a.m., a nurse recorded his stable condition. At 7:15 a.m., the bed was empty. Only this time, the sheets were still warm. Hartman was seen standing by the window, staring into the snow. He spoke to no one. Later that day, the nurse wrote a single sentence on a scrap of paper. There was no time for him to walk. She folded the paper and placed it inside her shoe. A hospital attendant, Reeves, who had previously resigned without explanation, briefly visited the hospital after hearing rumors. He spoke privately with 2 remaining staff members, his face pale. He told them, "I followed him once to the old ice house. He didn't know I was there." When asked what he saw, Reeves trembled and replied, he had the leg with him. It was wrapped so gently, like it once belonged to someone he cared for, and he didn't look around him. He looked ahead. He looked like someone returning home. Reeves left the hospital once more. He was not seen in town again. February 18th, the furnace failed entirely. Pipes burst, rooms filled with ice. Instruments froze to the trays. That night, the hospital recorded 5 patient deaths due to hypothermia. Hartman was said to have remained awake for almost 36 hours straight. He treated 3 cases of frostbite with amputations. He did not attend the funerals, but that was not unusual. What was unusual was that 2 of the deceased patients did not arrive at the funeral homes at all. By this point, whispers had transformed into quiet belief. Staff avoided direct confrontation, but avoidance itself spoke louder. They began to wonder whether the cold around the hospital was not indifferent, but drawn. That perhaps trauma did not merely occur within the walls. Perhaps it was being collected. Nurse Davies, who had been silent until then, made a private decision. She began writing down not just what was missing, but what remained. She wrote, "Patients no longer fear surgery. They fear recovery. Dr. Hartman no longer looks at wounds. He looks past them. The cold is strongest near the far door. I think he goes outside, not to clear his mind, but to carry something with him. I fear the snow remembers every footstep." The fifth disappearance marked the turning point. A young telegraph operator was brought in with frostbite in both hands. Hartman debated amputation of all 10 fingers. The operator asked if at least some could be saved. Hartman answered, "Some parts of us," and he paused, "need not be preserved." The operation was performed. When the young man awoke, he asked Hartman if he would still be able to write messages. Hartman simply looked at him. The telegraph operator began to cry. He was seen alive at midnight by the nurse. At 4 in the morning, his bed was empty. Only this time, there were footprints in the snow outside the hospital. 2 sets, 1 pair of boots. 1 barefoot. The barefoot prints were small, and they stopped near the ice house. When authorities were faintly contacted, they were told that a storm prevented investigation. Records were not officially filed. The footprints melted by morning. The doctor remained at his post. In the final week of February, Hartman operated almost daily. He slept little, ate almost nothing. His hands remained steady, but his gaze drifted, as if focusing on something just beyond the edge of each human body. He began speaking softly to patients before anesthesia, but not with reassurance. More like confession. One nurse claimed she heard him say, "If I take the part that suffered, perhaps the rest will no longer remember." Another claimed that once he whispered, "They sleep warmer when they leave colder." She wasn't sure if she heard correctly, or if she wanted to. On the evening of February 28th, a severe storm struck. Winds howled through the gaps in the window. Frames, the lamps flickered. The building moaned as though it were breathing. That night, Hartman performed surgery on a man with gangrenous toes. The storm rattled the walls. At one moment, the lights went out completely. For nearly a minute, the room was lit only by the snow through the cracks. A nurse later said she saw Hartman standing absolutely still, hands frozen in air, staring at the wound. She thought she heard him say, "Listen." Then the lights returned, and he continued. As though nothing had changed, but everything had. After that operation, something in the hospital felt altered. People moved more quietly. Patients spoke less. And the cold felt less like weather, more like presence. In her final note before requesting transfer, Davies wrote, "For a man who cuts so precisely, I wonder sometimes if he knows what he's trying to remove." 3 more days passed. 3 more disappearances. No more questions. Only waiting. 4. Thaw. For truth. March arrived without bringing warmth. The snow did not melt. It simply settled deeper, like old dust finally choosing where to stay. People in town began to speak less of weather and more of what the winter might have left behind. In the hospital, silence became the language most often used. Daylight lasted a little longer, yet the hallways never seemed brighter. The sun failed to reach certain corners, especially the corridor that led to the storage wing, especially the place beyond it. It was during this time that Nurse Charlotte Davies discovered Dr. Hartman's journal. She did not mean to. One morning, after he finished an operation and left the room to wash his hands, she noticed his coat, draped over a chair. Something in the pocket had shifted. She did not move to touch it. She only saw that the flap was open, that a page lay folded near the edge. She did not intend to read, but some stories do not wait for permission. Journal excerpts. February 22nd, 1903. There is no pain beneath frost. Only memory recalls hurt. Remove the memory, and the patient may heal in ways flesh cannot. Cold does not destroy. It pauses. We fear pause as death, when perhaps it is only stillness before something else. A man may live without a leg. May he live without the part that suffered? Davies read no further at that moment. She closed the pocket quietly. Her hands shook. She did not tell anyone what she saw. She would later claim, in a signed statement written years after retiring, that she feared speaking might make the words more real. That evening, a maintenance worker named Joseph Corbin was assigned to repair a frozen pipe behind the hospital's rear wing. He carried 2 tools, a lantern, and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He did not return. The lantern was found the next morning at the edge of the snowbank, near the path to the ICEHOUSE. It was still lit. No footprints around it, only the impression of something heavy dragged. Rumors began to leave the hospital with the wind. Town residents avoided the building after dark. Some whispered that voices could be heard from the lower windows, not of patients, but of something older, trapped behind walls long before the hospital was built. One elderly man told his grandson, "That land never thawed. They only built over. The cold." The boy repeated the phrase in church. The following Sunday, attendance was higher than usual. Inside the hospital, staff tried to keep routine, but routine meant underweight. On March 5th, a medical supply clerk noticed that bandage. Orders increased without matching patient documentation. When she brought this to Dr. Hartman, he simply nodded and said, "Not everything that needs binding leaves blood." She never questioned inventory again. Another journal excerpt was found, this time intentionally. Nurse Davies, unable to let her fear grow unchallenged, unlocked Hartman's office with a hairpin while he operated downstairs. She found the journal on the desk, open to a blank page, but with a smear near the edge that resembled the shade of dried frostbite. The ink was brittle. She turned back and read. Journal, February 28th. The body remembers in places, the mind refuses. That which froze in despair must be removed before thaw brings back sensation. They do not disappear. They are preserved. She closed the book. At that moment, she heard steps in the hall. She left immediately and locked the door from inside by mistake. No one ever asked why the lock broke that day. On March 8th, staff held a private meeting in the laundry room. 4 nurses, the supply clerk, and 1 young assistant. They spoke in low voices. No one suggested accusing the doctor. No. One suggested leaving. What they discussed was whether to silently send word to Chicago's Central Medical Board. This was never done. That same night, the assistant who had supported the idea was admitted as a patient. He had been found outside in the snow. No coat. No shoes. He could not explain why he had gone out. He only repeated. He said fresh air would stop the ache. He was operated on the next morning. His toes were removed. He smiled after waking. By evening, his bed was empty. The weeks passed not with routine, but with repetition. Operation. Recovery. Pause. Absence. Tracking ceased. Logbooks were incomplete. Some pages were torn out entirely. Patients stopped asking questions. Even those who might have survived now fell silent. One man, upon waking from surgery, whispered, "I feel nothing." Hartman responded. Then the operation succeeded. The man died that night, though no cause was documented. The cold deepened. It began to feel as if the hospital itself breathed slower. As if waiting. Journal, March 11th. I no longer seek to remove dead flesh. I seek to extract what remains trapped. In it, the ice does not kill. It holds. Each winter takes something. I am merely helping it take what it came for. On March 14th, Nurse Davies finally spoke to Dr. Hartman directly. She confronted him in the operating room while he prepared for another frostbite case. She asked, "Doctor, do you believe they survive after they ... after they go?" He paused ... then. He said, without turning, "Not in ways we recognize." She asked nothing further. He dismissed her from the room. She did not return to assist that day. Afterward, she vomited in the empty corridor near the icehouse door. She told no one. Whispers of death became whispers of preservation. People said the doctor did not lose patience. He kept them. That he did not simply cut skin and bone. He cut away grief. That what disappeared was not people, but their pain. No one could say whether that made it better. One final incident led to irreversible change. A young girl, 8 years old, was brought in with frostbite in both hands after being found in an alley during a blizzard. She was conscious but delirious. She repeated one phrase. "He said I'd be warm if I stayed outside." The nurses assumed she meant a relative. Hartman insisted they operate immediately. Against protocol, he removed both hands, stating that circulation was beyond salvage. The child survived the operation. That night, a nurse remained at her bedside. Around 2:10 a.m., the child whispered something. The nurse bent closer and heard. "He asked me to wait for him in the cold." The nurse looked toward the hallway. At that exact moment, the door at the far end opened, though no person stood there. A draft entered. A lamp flickered. When the nurse turned back to the bed, it was empty. The window was still closed. No footprints, only the impression that someone had lain there minutes earlier. By the next morning, half the staff resigned. Those who stayed did not speak of reasons. Hartman remained calm. He continued operating. Final journal entry, March 15th. "I feel them now, not gone resting. There is a place beneath the ice where suffering is still. If we could only lay our sorrow there, perhaps it would not return with spring. Tomorrow, I will go where they wait." That evening, during the largest storm of the year, Dr. Elias Hartman was seen walking toward the ICEHOUSE. He carried no lantern. No bag, no coat. He did not return. The next morning, the door to the icehouse was found slightly open. Some said they saw frost forming from inside, as though the cold were trying to escape. No one went in. Not that day. Not ever. When the thaw finally came that April, the first ground to soften was everywhere, except near the ICEHOUSE. It remained frozen for 6 years. Even during summer, the hospital continued to function under new supervision. Hartman was declared missing. His journal was never submitted as evidence. Davies kept the only known copy. She never spoke of it publicly. Years later, when the icehouse was finally demolished, workers found rusted surgical instruments embedded inside the walls. No bodies, only linen wrappings, neatly folded, still cold. Spring of 1903 came to Chicago like a rumor, gently, uncertainly, as though not fully convinced it was allowed to stay. Snow melted along the streets, water ran beneath the cobblestones, and birds began to return. Yet one place remained untouched. Behind the hospital, the old icehouse still stood. The frost along its northern wall was unchanged, and the window panes remained clouded, as if winter still pressed its face against them from within. People avoided the building even after the storms ended. Children would not play near it. Dogs would not approach. On warm days, fog rose around its base. Not like steam, but like breath. No one mentioned Dr. Elias Hartman aloud anymore. Not because they had forgotten, because remembering seemed to make the air colder. The hospital resumed operation under a new chief surgeon, a man who insisted on modern care and strict record-keeping. He replaced much of the staff and ordered all previous patient files to be reviewed. Many were incomplete. Several were missing. One was deliberately burned. No one ever discovered who destroyed it. Nurse Charlotte Davies remained in her position until the end of summer. She worked quietly, spoke little, and avoided the corridor near the back entrance. One afternoon in July, she handed in her resignation and left without collecting her final pay. Years later, requested to provide testimony. For an internal inquiry, she sent a short letter instead. It read, "You cannot remove pain by discarding what carried it. You must allow it to be felt." I believe he meant to help them. I also believe he listened too long to the cold. At the bottom, she added, "There are some wounds that do not close because they are not meant to." The ice offered silence, not healing. She signed it, but did not provide an address. Her letter was placed in a file. Then it was quietly taken out. No one claimed responsibility. In autumn of that year, the hospital's storage wing was dismantled. Workers avoided removing the ice house due to budgeting delays. It remained standing through another winter. And another. It was finally scheduled for demolition in 1909. By that time, rumors had become folklore. Some said that during particularly cold evenings, a faint light could be seen moving inside. Others claimed to have heard a man's voice speaking calmly, as though in consultation. A caretaker once reported hearing the measured rhythm of surgical saws. No investigation was conducted. The ice house was finally torn down in June of 1909. The workers did not speak of what they found inside until much later. They expected rot. They found stillness. No bodies. No scent of decay. Just an imprint on the floor. The approximate length of a man, as though something heavy had thawed long enough to leave a mark before evaporating. Along the far wall, 6 neatly folded linen wraps remained undisturbed. They were not damp. They were cold. When touched, a thin layer of frost formed beneath the workers' fingertips. The instruments discovered, embedded in the interior, were removed and sent to scrap. They included 2 bone saws, 1 with ivory handle, 3 forceps, 1 surgical scalpel, blade dull and cracked, 1 measuring caliper with ink residue on hinge. One of the workers, a former medical student, claimed there were exactly enough tools to perform an amputation. He was refused permission to take them. For study. They were destroyed by fire. Except for the caliper, which went missing before disposal. That year, during the hottest recorded summer, something unusual occurred. At the very spot where the ice house stood, the ground froze one night in August. Only for 3 hours. Only in a square, exactly matching the footprint of the building. No one stepped over it. No one spoke of it in official reports. But someone did draw its outline in chalk. The next day, the chalk had faded. The soil was soft. Local authorities closed the matter. Publicly, Dr. Hartman's disappearance was attributed to exhaustion and presumed suicide. Privately, it was suggested that he walked into the lake during the storm of March 15th. No body was recovered. Some believe he was never lost, only preserved. Years later, in 1921, a former nurse from the hospital, old, with a mild tremor in her voice, gave a recorded statement to a physician studying historical trauma. She said she had worked under Hartman and remembered the winter. She said he believed he was sparing them the return of pain. He never asked if they wished to remember. When asked why she left the hospital, she replied, "Because I began to wonder whether he had cut away parts of himself long before the ice took anything else." She died 3 months later. In her personal journal, found by distant relatives, she had written only 4 words beneath her final entry: "They do not thaw." By 1937, the hospital had been rebuilt with modern facilities. The original structure was nearly forgotten. Except during heavy winter storms, when windows in the new surgical wing froze from the inside, forming patterns resembling finger marks among staff. An informal rule developed. No operations are scheduled after midnight during snowstorms. No one remembers when the rule began, but they follow it. In 1958, a small group of historians researching medicine in Illinois came across a reference to unrecorded frost-related amputations from the early 1900s. While reviewing archives, they noticed gaps between February and March of 1903. One mentioned this to a retired nurse who had trained at the hospital in the 1930s. She warned them not to continue. When asked why, she said, "Some frost never melted. If you dig in the wrong place, you might hear it cracking." The research was abandoned. One of the historians kept a single note in his personal folder. Hartman believed pain was stored like ice, to be broken and removed. He underlined broken twice. In 1974, during renovation of the hospital grounds, a backhoe uncovered something metallic near the location of the former ice house. Work was halted. The foreman inspected the site. He found a small metal hinge, rusted but intact. It appeared to be from a medical measuring tool. No further items were recovered. He ordered the area filled and sealed. The hinge was placed in a toolbox. He passed away a year later. When his belongings were sorted, the hinge was not found. The report also mentioned that his freezer, though unplugged, remained solid with ice inside. In 1999, during a severe winter, a surgeon working the night shift alone claimed to have heard slow footsteps outside the operating room. He believed it was a patient wandering unattended. When he opened the door, the corridor was empty, but the floor beneath the window was lightly frosted. It was the only part of the hospital at sub-zero temperature. He later noted, "It felt as though someone walked barefoot." He did not write this addition into the official log. He only mentioned it in a handwritten memo folded into his lab coat. It was discovered 8 years later. The coat was found in the staff library. No one recalled seeing him place it there. He had retired in 2002, citing persistent cold-related illness. Despite mild winters since. To this day, no record has ever officially acknowledged what transpired in the winter of 1903. But some silent practices remain. During amputation procedures, surgeons occasionally pause without clear reason. When that happens, instruments are not removed until after the pause ends. No one speaks during that pause. Some say they feel watched. Others say they feel someone waiting. When asked by new trainees why protocol requires silence at certain moments, senior staff usually respond, "It is for the sake of the parts we remove." If asked further, they never explain. In 2017, a hospital archivist cataloging old surgical records found a name scratched faintly onto the back of an inventory sheet. E. Hartman below it, in faint pencil, a sentence: "What winter keeps, spring should not awaken." She assumed it was a hoax. She tore the sheet and discarded it. But she claims that that same night, she saw frost gathering on the inside of her office window. Despite the heating being functional. She took no picture. She resigned 3 days later. There are no further documented events, only occasional stories. A door that sticks during snow. A window that fogs when Simone discusses amputations. An operating lamp that flickers for precisely 1 minute, then steadies. On those occasions, staff grow quiet. Not afraid, only respectful. As if remembering something they were never told. As if listening for something that waits where the cold once deepened. In the basement of the hospital, between 2 storage rooms, there is an unmarked door sealed shut. New staff often assume it leads to utility access. Older staff never stand near it for long. They say the air is colder there, and that sometimes, if the wind blows just right, it sounds like breathing.